Alrighty, welcome everybody to SEAOSD January monthly meeting. Today we have our presentation with Jeremy Callister, who's going to be presenting on the SEAOC Blue Book. But before that, we get to him. Wanted to do a few chapter announcements. Okay, so we have a couple events coming up. Our first event is a very major event in our calendar. It's our annual student night. It's on February 23rd. We'll be in an all virtual format this year, but we have some very exciting things planned, and hopefully everybody will be able to interact as much as possible the way that we always like to be able to socialize and talk to everybody milling around and meet a lot of people, and I get to meet a lot of basically our fresh crop of engineers. So we do have sponsorships available. Our board will be reaching out to all of you shortly, if we haven't already, to help put on this great event. So hope you all are able to attend and make the event as great as possibly could be. Next, we also have our joint meeting with ACI. This will be on March 16th. Bo, I don't have off the top of my head who the actual speaker is. So can you fill us in on the speaker? I know it has to do with some concrete specifications.
Yeah, it's the recent updates to ACI 301, the concrete specification, and those changes, that document just came out late last year. So Michelle Williams, who was instrumental, I think she was leading that committee actually. She's with PCA, and she's going to be giving the presentation on the significant changes and an overview of the document as well.
Okay. I hope all of you will attend our meeting with ACI in March. And one other event that I'd like to put on there, it's on my list of things to look at. We are planning on having the SEAOSD golf tournament May 10th. I don't know if we've actually set the announcement out there yet, but I wanted to put those there as a save the date. We are planning on having our golf tournament on May 10th. So hopefully you all will be able to enjoy join us out there at Twin Oaks Valley Golf Course. So with that, I will pass it along to Bo to introduce our speaker.
All right, thanks. So we're happy to have Jeremy Callister from Degenkolb presenting today. Jeremy is an associate principal with Degenkolb Engineers and has developed a significant portfolio of work with new building design, seismic retrofit, foundation underpinning, shoring work, as well as consulting services. Some notable new design projects have been in the healthcare arena. They include new multi-story acute care facilities. He's led a variety of retrofit designs, historic structures to central plants. Jeremy is also an active member of the Structural Engineers Association of California, SEAOC. He's a past director of SEAOSD and the past chair of the Seismology Committee for SEAOSD and SEAOC. One thing as we get started with the presentation, if any questions come up, just jot those down in the comments section of Teams, and we'll touch on those at the end of the presentation. So with that, Jeremy, hand it off to you and take it away.
Great. I assume you can hear me now, and let me share my screen here. And maybe if Bo or Steve can let me know you can see my screen and you can hear me okay?
Looking good and sounding good.
Great, thank you. This was a presentation that I put together with Benjamin Moore, who was a member of the Seismology Committee out of Northern California. His role was more on the kind of the first half of the slides, which are regarding the history of the Blue Book, and my content was more related to one of the articles that this presentation is going to highlight on, and that is on the article on performance-based design. So the first Blue Book, I assume most of you on the call know what the Blue Book is. I assume when you joined the Structural Engineers Association, they used to give you hard copies of the Blue Book. I don't know if that's still the case or not. Hopefully they're still giving copies of the Blue Book to new inductees of SEAOSD. But the Blue Book was first published in 1959, and it was a document put together by the Seismology Committee of SEAOC, and it essentially was a precursor to the UBC earthquake provisions, which subsequently evolved into the NEHA provisions. And that first Blue Book, this was it. It was only 9 pages long and provided some pretty simple recommendations for seismic design. And it stayed that way for a while. And then in 1971, after the San Fernando earthquake, that earthquake demonstrated the need for improved seismic design. So there was a re-emphasis on reassessing what those guidelines included and what those requirements are. And so the Applied Technology Council was actually founded in 1973 by members of SEAOC, and it was originally conceived as essentially SEAOC's research arm. And that's if SEAOC felt like there was research needs, essentially the ATC, or the Applied Technology Council, was the organization that would essentially spearhead those research efforts. ATC, of course, has now grown to national organization and handles wind issues and all different related engineering issues, not just seismic issues. But this ATC, one of its earliest documents was ATC 306, which was essentially tentative provisions for the development of seismic regulations. And this was essentially a forerunner to ASCE 788. So the Blue Book early on, the Blue Book was a few pages of seismic recommendations. ATC documents started to enhance those recommendations. And then through the 80s and 90s, the Blue Book essentially was linking the code provisions to past judgment and contemporary research. And there's clear parallels between the Blue Book language and the contemporary code language. So a transition happened after 1999 as the codes began to transition to a more national code process. The Blue Book transitioned to be more of a commentary to the code, as opposed to actually providing the basis for the code language regarding the seismic sections. Also, we started to get a lot more, we'll call them resources in the seismic realm. We had, NEHRP had a bunch of publications regarding recommendations for dealing with seismic design and seismic issues. We have SEAOC itself doing conventions and having proceedings where recommendations and guidelines are looked at. We have then specialty publications. For example, PEER has the Tall Building Initiative, which are guidelines for seismic performance-based design of tall buildings. You have NEHRP actually providing specific recommendations for seismic design. You then have commentary to ASCE 7 documents. You have commentary to ACI. You have commentary to the different steel provisions. You have some more commentary. And then, of course, you have all the research articles that are out there. And what was kind of a limited resources and limited publications back in the 50s and 60s has now turned into almost an overwhelming amount of of information that can fill libraries of all the different engineering offices and can be a little overwhelming. And I was reminded of a quote from T.S. Eliot, who was a poet, where he said, "Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? And where is the knowledge we have lost in information?" And you can think about all that information we have out there. It's going to take knowledge, and it's going to take engineering wisdom to decipher and to use that information. You can even apply this quote to maybe a young engineer. You know, any young engineer can create an engineering model and create mountains of data as output from that model, but it takes knowledge and wisdom, engineering experience, to basically interpret that information. So in that context, the SEAOC Seismology Committee realized we don't want to create another commentary and add additional commentary to the code. There's already a lot of that out there. There are already other procedures for the actual code writing process isn't really in the hands of SEAOC anymore. So what is the role of the Seismology Committee, and what is the role of the Blue Book? And so the goal of the 2019 Blue Book was to have a different vision than some of the past editions of the Blue Book. And this role of the new Blue Book was essentially to provide, I would call it, engineering wisdom to the community. So the Seismology Committee is still asked to interpret and to provide recommendations for practice. To even the Seismology Committee still will ask to vote on different code change proposals. But the new role is essentially providing significant insights for the engineers. Its new role is also to help resolve questions of regulatory interpretation. The new role is to have a little more of a California focus. The Seismology Committee also, as part of the Blue Book, is to print or to publicize what is the Seismology Committee position on a particular topic. So the Seismology Committee has 12 members, and as opposed to just the view of an individual engineer or individual company or individual author or researcher, it's essentially a consensus of this 12-member committee. And we believe that's pretty important because it's not just the opinion of one person or one company, or it's just not the opinion of a certain company who is trying to sell a certain type of proprietary product. It's a pretty well-rounded committee that is looking at a certain issue from different angles. And so the Blue Book it provides a mechanism for the committee to provide its opinion on some matters that may be in question in regards to seismic issues. Also, we identified there are many national publications, but we believe the Blue Book is still, it's a SEAOC publication and needs to have a California focus and needs to focus on what we call the California practice. And we believe that as engineers in California, that we understand seismic design, that we need to lead the way in its proper implementation and use of the code. I'm sure many of you have run across experiences where maybe you have come across calculations or designs done by maybe others that are not in California that may have California licenses, and maybe those designs aren't something that we would necessarily want to see promulgated throughout the industry. And so the Blue Book is an opportunity for us to make recommendations that can really raise the bar in regards to the seismic practice in California. And part of that focus is on just attention to the principles that the code and standards have, and that still have difficulty quantifying, like regularities, irregularities, reliability, capacity design, and resilience. So the new Blue Book's role was to essentially be more focused on improving the engineering practice. And, you know, it used to be the Blue Book was the bridge between research and standards, but now the Blue Book can be described as a bridge between the standards and practice. And I'll just point out that we owe a huge debt to those engineers that came before us who contributed to previous editions of the Blue Book. And with the 2019 version of the Blue Book, we had to decide as to how much of that history did we include, just for providing people perspective, but also trying to weigh that versus having a document that is not too excessively long. So what we decided was we kept some of the history of the articles that had been previously written, but some other articles we decided not to carry forward. But those previous articles are all still available to engineers that are members of SEAOC. And I believe they're now all available online, but we can confirm that with Don Shinsky, the executive director of SEAOC. So the 2019 Blue Book, it was the 60th anniversary and the 9th edition of the Blue Book. So some of the key changes is all the articles are updated to include references to the ASCE 716, the 2019 CBC and associated material standards. Of course, this is more than just going in and changing 10 to 16. It's basically the committee looked at the past articles, looked at what were the differences in ASCE 710 to ASCE 716, and made revisions accordingly. So many of the articles had significant revisions to them. There was also new articles such as seismic isolation, performance-based design, engineering. There's an article on the seismic design of stairs, which has the newer code has some additional requirements. And so that's a great article as well. And some differences with this 2019 Blue Book, we realized that it's great to have an article, something that we can call a book, that it's printed. So there's hard copies, there's also PDF versions, and there's single articles are also available on the SEAOC website. So we have an ability to update and improve articles online, but to make it well known and distribute the book to everyone within the seismology or everyone within SEAOC. The decision was made to let's also do a printing, and that was done in 2019, and it was introduced at the 2019 SEAOC convention. So that's some history of the Blue Book and where it is now, and the intent for the Blue Book moving forward is to continue to provide this bridge between the code and practice. So I want to spend the next part of my presentation here to discuss, highlight one of the articles that was included, one of the new articles that was included in the 2019 edition of the Blue Book, and that was the performance-based seismic design article. And this article was not intended to do a deep dive. It's only 10 pages, but I think is a pretty good reference and resource regarding performance-based seismic design, especially for a younger engineer who's heard different terms and heard maybe different methodologies that are out there. This recaps a lot of those pretty well. So I'm just going to jump right in. So I think the key point is with the performance-based seismic design is what is the definition of that? So really the definition we chose was that performance-based seismic design is really not, you're not restricting the design to a conformance with a series of prescriptive criteria, but rather the designer must demonstrate using any of the several methods that a proposed design is capable of providing a specified performance objective. And that was the definition that we went with. And early in their article, it includes a large table of the various publications, and we'll call it milestones, that have impacted performance-based seismic design. And as a young engineer, I even experience this now. There are so many different FEMA publications you may hear referenced. There are so many different ATC publications, even the ASCE documents. It's easy to kind of hear those and get confused as to what is what and what played a role. And if you were to lay them out chronologically, at least some of those key publications and milestones, you could lay something out like in this format, but then you start trying to draw arrows and connecting, well, this ATC 14 fed into ASCE 31, FEMA 283 fed into FEMA 349, which fed into FEMA 445, which fed into FEMA P58. So it can get kind of confusing. This Blue Book article does a pretty good job of trying to identify how those different publications fed into each other. So, and then it does a brief overview of some of these initial key milestone publications. So one of the, historically speaking, performance-based design-wise, one of the earliest documents was the Army Technical Manual, which was 1979, which was an early developer of establishing performance-based seismic design criteria, and essentially required two simulation methods, an elastic analysis and a static pushover analysis. And that was one of the earlier publications that we could find. And then many of you may have heard of ASCE 31, which is now rolled in ASCE 41, but it talks about some of the history of ASCE 31 and how there were earlier ATC documents, ATC 14, ATC 22, FEMA 178, which formalized this process of evaluating existing buildings. And if you're not familiar with these documents, these essentially paved the way for establishing common building types. So the table on the left, of all our existing buildings, we can classify in certain building types, and whether it's wood framed, concrete moment frame, concrete shear wall. And once we establish the building type, then there are various checklists that we use, that we run through to do a quick evaluation of the building. And as part of those quick evaluations of these buildings, we're identifying if elements are deformation controlled or force controlled. And all that was basically developed in ASCE 31 and its precursors. Also around that time in 1993, you had Nigel Priestley's direct displacement-based design was introduced, and this process was relatively simple, and it's summarized in his 2007 publication pretty well. Well, it includes proposed model language and incorporating the direct displacement-based design methodology. And direct displacement-based design is basically you're conceptualizing your structure as a single degree of freedom, and its displacement ductility is calculated. The dampen ratio is then determined. You're then calculating an effective period is related to design is related to the design displacement using a displacement response spectrum. The effective stiffness is determined from the effective period, and then you're arriving at your base shear. So with displacement-based design, you're basically kind of working the opposite direction than you would be from what many of you may be familiar with an equivalent lateral force method, where you're calculating forces on the building and then calculating displacements. With the displacement-based design, you're essentially identifying what displacements do you want, and then working essentially backwards to identify what those equivalent demands are going to be related to that. Another key publication was in 1995, was called the SEAOC Vision 2000 document. And this was a publication that conceptualized the framework for developing a comprehensive set of performance-based seismic design guidelines. And this document was important because it popularized performance-based design and started to really generate some worldwide interest in the subject. And you can imagine, why it came out in 1995 was after the 1994 Northridge earthquake. People were observing differences in, or how should I say that? Some buildings weren't performing as we were expecting them to perform. And so SEAOC realized we need to understand this better. We need to help the decision makers and the public at large understand the difference between a code design building and maybe a more enhanced design. And that started the framework. And this is from that SEAOC 2000 document. That document used an equal displacement based design type of an approach. And I don't need to go into it here, but it's summarized in the Blue Book article, and it also has the references to that SEAOC 2000 publication. You also had various FEMA documents, which were a result of the Northridge earthquake, which identified an action plan for performance-based design. So FEMA had multiple studies, had multiple, some of the key engineering experts, structural engineering experts, come together and try to put together a roadmap for how do we get performance-based design to be adopted, what guidelines do we need, how much research is needed, and it essentially laid out this roadmap for how much research funding they thought they would need, where were the holes, what research needed to be done. Those documents essentially pointed and led towards what's called the ATC FEMA, the P58 document, which we'll talk about a little later. Also in that time frame in '96, you had ATC 40, which was developing site performance-based design. Now this was specific to concrete buildings. So you had efforts looking at performance-based design kind of globally, but then you also had efforts looking at performance-based design specifically to certain building types. And like I said, there was the ATC 58 document. So if you remember, this was ATC 58, this was the monumental effort over 10 years of developing procedures for estimating what we call the 3Ds: death, dollars, and downtime. And various large FEMA publications that are available free for download. But it's a pretty overwhelming document. To quickly go through the methodology, essentially you're creating a building performance model, and that building performance model has different fragility curves that are related to the different components of the building. You're also then defining the earthquake hazards, and then you're basically analyzing the building response. Obviously, this is a 10,000 foot level overview of what FEMA P58 is doing, which is it's a very statistical method. You're developing a collapse fragility based on the model and the hazards, and then you're essentially then calculating performance estimates of how is the exterior skin going to behave? How are the interior partitions going to behave based on the displacements they undergo? And to do all this Monte Carlo type of simulations, that FEMA document created what was called a PACT tool, which is essentially a large spreadsheet to help run through that analysis. Which was still somewhat cumbersome. So recently in 2018, there was a FEMA P58-2 document which came out, which improved upon what FEMA P58 had developed, came out with different documents to try to encourage the use of that P58 methodology, improved the library of all these fragility curves, improved its calibration, include benchmarking of results, included design aids, also include what we call tools for stakeholders. So ways of communicating what the P58 analysis is doing with non-engineers, essentially. That was FEMA P58. Of course, you then have ASCE 41, which these ATC and FEMA documents, various ATC and FEMA documents fed into ASCE 41. And these documents essentially set up the process of identifying that certain elements have certain deformation limits, and that we can classify how well a building performs based on whether it's a collapse prevention level or life safety or immediate occupancy, based on the deformation or drifts of these certain elements within the building. And that was established, well known in ASCE 41, but initially developed in these earlier ATC and FEMA documents. Another resource I wanted to identify that's related to ASCE 41 is the FEMA 2006 document. So this actually, many of you know that, especially if you haven't done a lot of that type of ASCE 41 type of work, it can be a little overwhelming to try to do an ASCE 41 analysis, because it's different than a typical code analysis, and some of the terms of deformation controlled, force controlled may be new to you. And there actually is a great resource. This FEMA P2006 is essentially example problems of going through an ASCE 41 analysis. And it has examples on all different types of buildings, wood frame tuck under parking, moment frames, steel braced frames, concrete shear walls, has linear and a nonlinear discussion, URM buildings, foundations. So it's a FEMA document. So it's free PDF on the FEMA website. That's a great resource to engineers who are going to be using ASCE 41. Also, at the same time, or over the years, you've had specific performance-based design guidelines specific to tall buildings. So PEER had the Tall Building Initiative. At the same time, you also had the Los Angeles Tall Building Seismic Design, I think, Council also has a similar guidelines, which includes recommendations for performance-based design, specifically for tall buildings, because they are, different than your traditional low-rise, mid-rise building. What does ASCE 7 have to say about performance-based design? So initially ASCE 710 included commentary or language in the commentary regarding target reliabilities in terms of conditional probability. And that was the way it essentially hinted at performance-based design. And ASCE 716, a lot of that language from the commentary had then moved into the actual provisions, and basically indicates you can use essentially this reliability probabilistic approach, which is essentially a way of saying performance-based, one way of saying performance-based seismic design, if it's approved by the authority having jurisdiction. But ASCE 716 in the commentary does recognize ASCE 41 and the tall building document as essentially acceptable mechanisms for using performance-based design. So there is essentially a code path. It just needs to be approved by the authority having jurisdiction. Other key publications, ATC 120. So you can't talk about performance-based design without talking about the non-structural components, especially if you have a client that wants to achieve a beyond life safety. Maybe they want an immediate type of occupancy, type of performance level. They want to be able to continue operations after an earthquake. The non-structural systems have to be evaluated and considered. And so ATC 20 was a large research effort that looked at can you look at performance-based design in regards to non-structural equipment and utility systems. Another ATC document which recently came out in 2018 was ATC 114, and this was essentially looking at hysteretic envelope models with the intent to support the development of ASCE 7 and ASCE 41. And there's also various NIST guidelines that have been developed, and even some current NIST programs. So some of you that have done ASCE 41 have maybe realized, if you're looking at something that was designed per ASCE 47, and then you're looking at something that was maybe checked per ASCE 41, maybe there's not a great meshing there. In some instances, you could design a building per ASCE 7, and then if you check it per ASCE 41, you may be getting items that are shown as being flagged or deficient, and which didn't really make sense. So NIST has done a number of studies to essentially better understand how do we get ASCE 7 and 41 to essentially coordinate with each other. How do we get the performance levels to be consistent across those? And so there's been a decent amount of research that is fed into ASCE 4117 based on that NIST research. So also continuing on with calibration improvements, ATC 140, which is, I think, projected still for 2023. So that's going to produce case studies and standard code change proposals. And that's going to have, that research is going to lead into ASCE 41. So obviously, these documents are not perfect. These methodologies are not perfect. But the industry is making efforts to improve them and to continue to calibrate and to make them more consistent in how they're applied. So which performance-based seismic design methodologies should you use? Which one is the best? Maybe that's why you want to look at this article is there's different methodologies out there. Which one is the best? And to be frank, the intent of the article was not to try to answer that question, and because the real answer, it really depends, and it depends on your capabilities, it depends on the client, it depends on the building type. But that article is essentially intended to give you that background to maybe for you to do your own research. So I want to do a little bit of a sidetrack here and do what I call story time here. So this is a picture of Florence Chadwick. She was a famous long distance swimmer, and she's actually from San Diego. I think she went to Point Loma High School. And in 1952, Florence Chadwick was famous for having swum the English Channel. And now on July 4th, 1952, she was attempting to swim the 21 miles from Southern California mainland to Catalina Island. And you can imagine that's a very long swim. And that was back in the day when you don't have fancy neoprene wetsuits. They would basically rub grease or lard on their bodies to insulate them, to keep them warm as they swam in waters. And on this particular day, The water is freezing. It was 48 degrees. The fog was thick. Visibility was almost nil. And as she was a half mile from her destination, she became discouraged and she quit. And the next day, the reporters, clamored around her at a press conference, asking her why she had quit. Had it been too cold, or was the distance too long? And she responded, I was licked by the fog. It was too foggy. She then recalled a similar experience that when she was actually swimming the English Channel, the fog was just as thick. It was just as cold. She was totally exhausted. She was about to give up, and she was reaching out to her father, who was in a boat next to her. And as she did that, her father pointed, and she looked, and the fog had parted just enough that she was able to see the shore. And with that new vision, she pressed on and became actually the first woman to swim the English Channel. The point of this story that I like to share is with increased vision comes increased motivation. Well, what does this have to do with performance-based design or the Blue Book? Well, performance-based design gives us the tools and it gives us the vocabulary to speak with our clients and the community to help them understand what a resilient building infrastructure could look like. We now have the tools to communicate to them what a code designed building, how that will perform, how it's expected to perform in an earthquake, and how a building that is designed, we'll call it beyond the code provisions, how that will perform in an earthquake. We can help give the community and our clients a better vision of better seismic performance. And I believe that with that vision, they'll have motivation to make those decisions. They'll have motivation to pay for increased fees to do that analysis, and they'll have the motivation to pay a little more in the construction cost to get a better performing building down the road. But it really takes us to communicate that vision to them. How many of our clients know what a code performing building delivers? Not many, I'm sure. So it's on us to really help communicate to them what we're providing, but what we could provide. And this slide is showing, for example, that FEMA P58-7 document includes different tools for communicating with decision makers and the community. And it's just a simple graphic trying to communicate how different building types, whether it's new, whether it's base isolated, whether it's an enhanced code design, what the ramifications of those decisions are. So there are tools out there that make it easier for us to help communicate with our clients. The entire FEMA P58 tool is to be able to run that type of an analysis where we can say, look, basic code building, it meets the code, but you may not be able to use it for weeks to months after an earthquake, and the repair costs are high. Whereas if we did a more enhanced type of design, you'll be able to use that building more quickly, and the initial building costs may be a little higher, but the repair costs are going to be lower. So let's help our clients and the community get a vision of how performance-based design can help them improve this earthquake resilience. So I also just wanted to put a plug in for asking engineers and those of you on the call to get involved, to participate in your local and state SEAOC and SEAOSD committees. Seems like every year there's always some type of code or ballot change language that's available for review and comment. Victor is now the chair of the seismology committee. He typically sends those out, asking for input. And it's actually been I've really enjoyed my involvement on the seismology committee at a local level, getting to meet some of the engineers here in San Diego, but also being able to act as a delegate and meet engineers from all over California. And there's some really sharp engineers that I've been able to just, learn from them and collaborate with them on different issues. And so it's been a great experience. So just another plug to really get involved in SEAOC. And with that, I don't know if there's any specific questions that anybody has. I haven't been monitoring the chat. Maybe I'll rely on Steve or Bo to let me know if there's any questions.
Okay. Well, yeah, thanks so much, Jeremy. Yeah, right now I don't see any questions in the chat. So if anything did come to mind, go ahead and get that in. Yeah, thanks a lot, Jeremy. Really informative. Thanks for that summary. And at least for me, it was good to know, good to learn about how the SEAOSD committee and the seismology committee tie into some of these other organizations, FEMA and NEHRP and things like that. That was very interesting to me. So I appreciate that. I think maybe while we give people a couple of minutes, maybe if you wanted to just touch on, at the end you sort of summarized how maybe satisfying it has been to be involved in these committees, but maybe just touch on more specifics on what being a member or being involved in the seismology committee means for someone maybe considering it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that can kind of parlay into maybe what the future of the Blue Book is as well. So, which I didn't really cover that well. So that's a great question. Thanks, Bo. So right now, the seismology committee, Victor Garcia is the current San Diego chair. If you're interested in joining, please, you can reach out to me or Victor, or even just you could reach out to Heather, the executive director, and to be added to Victor's distribution list. So right now, and it really depends on the year of maybe what we're focusing on, but in some years there's maybe a lot of code change proposals, and those have a quick turnaround that maybe within 4 weeks we're notified of different code change proposals. There's backup research documents that are typically submitted with those, and as a committee we'll review them together, and then these code change proposals basically are national, so there's all different national organizations that will have a vote, and SEAOSD has a vote. So basically SEAOSD will meet together. If it's a seismic issue, typically the seismology committee is asked to essentially vote for the SEAOSD organization. So some years there's quite a bit of time spent on researching what is the code change proposal, how is its impact going to be on the design practice, is the code change merited, and just as an interesting note, anytime if you vote yes, you can always just vote yes. You don't have to state why. If you're going to vote no on any type of code change proposal, due to the statute requirements or the legal requirements, any no vote, you have to provide a reason as to why there's a no vote. And if we provide a no vote on a certain item, then there is another committee which basically reviews all the no votes and will provide a comment, a response to the no vote. But so long story short, sometimes there's a decent amount of code language or code change proposals that we'll review. And so it's kind of neat to see, you'll see stuff years in advance that eventually will make it into the code. So usually you're not surprised by any of the new code changes because you've seen them all a few years ahead of when they happened. Another item is, we'll get questions as to, we'll get questions from practicing engineers that say, look, the code isn't clear on this issue, and we're talking to a building department and we're not seeing eye to eye. We'd like the seismology committee to maybe provide an opinion on this item. So sometimes the seismology committee may look at an issue, and if there's a consensus, we can issue a white paper indicating what our opinion is on a certain matter. And there's also another big effort we'll do is what we'll call is the actual writing of new Blue Book articles. So if we see that there may be a gap between what we're seeing in the code and what we're seeing what the practice is doing, we will then try to identify, is there an article that we can help tie what the code is trying to say to what the practice is actually doing to help bridge that gap. And we usually will meet typically once every, I think, 1 to 2, maybe every 6 weeks or so. Here in San Diego, now the meetings are all virtually. And then San Diego has 2 delegates. Right now it's Victor Garcia and myself are the San Diego delegates, and we will meet 4 times a year with the statewide committee. And sometimes the state committee is working in parallel with the local committees, and sometimes there's we're working on different things. So it really just depends. We've worked on a variety of things over the years. So.
Right. Well, yeah, thanks. So yeah, absolutely an influential arm of SEAOSD and SEAOC for sure. Well, it doesn't look like we have any other questions. So I think with that, Jeremy, we're going to let you go. And again, a round of appreciation. Thanks so much for taking the time. And I think with that, we're going to wrap up the meeting. Okay, thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you next month.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.